Good evening and welcome back for the latest edition of the Four Score Speaker Series. I'm Jamie Stout, Director of Membership for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. We hope you're all safe and well at home. We appreciate your continued support of the foundation and our mission of providing cultural and educational programming. We know tonight is of special interest to you, our members, because we have over 225 of you registered. Lincoln and the railroad is always an educational and unique topic that comes up often around here. So we're really excited to have this tonight. For more than 150 years, Union Pacific and Abraham Lincoln have been linked. Abraham Lincoln had a lifelong interest in Western expansion and an unshakable conviction that railroads would strengthen our nation. His campaign platform had declared, quote, that a railroad to the Pacific Ocean is imperatively demanded by the interest of the whole country, that the federal government ought to render immediate and efficient aid in its construction, end quote. President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act of 1862. In doing so, he created the Union Pacific Railroad Company. Tonight, I am joined by Patricia LaBounty, who is the curator of the Union Pacific Collection and the manager of the Union Pacific Railroad Museum. An employee of Union Pacific, Patricia manages one of the oldest corporate collections in the museum and museums in America. Union Pacific's collection, displayed at this museum, draws visitors from all 50 states and more than 40 countries from all around the world. She began working at the Union Pacific Railroad Museum in 2006. She holds a BA in Anthropology from Whitman College and an MA in Museum Studies from the University of Oklahoma. Union Pacific has given generously to help build our museum and has continued to support our efforts to share Lincoln's legacy through financial support and board leadership. Their leadership never fails to pay tribute to the role Abraham Lincoln played in its origination and his choice of the Union Pacific Omaha home. One of our Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library's most treasured manuscripts in Lincoln's own hand includes the one in which he set the eastern terminus for the Union Pacific Railroad Company. We are grateful for our strong and long-time partnership. After Ms. LaBounty's presentation, she will be entertaining questions from the audience that you may have about Lincoln and the railroad. Please type those in the question and answer box below. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Patricia LaBounty.
All right. Jamie, thank you so much for having me here this evening. I am honored to be here tonight, and I'm honored to talk about the history that we share that you mentioned. But first, I would like to begin with a simple and powerful recognition that the land that I'm standing upon is and has always been held in reverence by several First Nations. I preserve that place here today out of respect and continuing recognition of the profound impact of the railroad on Native peoples. I encourage all of you to also take a moment to consider the land where you are and to make a similar private recognition. Now, while railroad history might first appear to be a story about steel and locomotives, it really is a story about people. It's about hard work and courage, about brutal conditions, amazing triumphs, and cultural disruption. It is the human aspect of our shared past that unites us and will help us move forward through these rich cultural connections. This is our history. Since 1862, Union Pacific has played a pivotal role in the evolution and development of what we consider to be the American landscape. Now, while it is a slight exaggeration to say that the history of Union Pacific is the history of the West, it is no exaggeration to say that these two histories are inextricably linked. As early as the 18th century, President Washington and James Madison expressed concerns about their newly created country being cohesive despite its great size. Most states in the new country easily being the size of entire European countries, and unifying them was a daunting task. By the 1830s, railroads looked like they could be the answer. A tool to compress time and space, making communication and unity possible over such long distances. The discovery of gold in California in the late 1840s, creating a market for transcontinental traffic and justifying finally the enormous expense of putting a railroad through the center of North America, made such a railroad seem possible and accelerated the flow of European settlers from the East. The Pacific Railway Act in 1862 granted land to both Union Pacific and Central Pacific, equaling 10 miles on either side of the tracks in alternating 1-mile sections. Every other square mile was retained by the federal government. This amount was increased to 20 miles in 1864. The Homestead Act, also passed in 1862, provided a way for settlers to also acquire land on the intervening government-retained sections. And the grant of this land and the land grants that followed was predicated upon the fact that the claim of Native peoples be nullified. In just 5 years, from 1860 to 1865, President Abraham Lincoln permanently altered the course of the nation's history with the origination and creation of one of the country's largest engineering feats. Completed on May 10, 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah, the Transcontinental Railroad transformed the United States, impacting generations of people. But let's talk about that impact for a moment. Why was this railroad so important? In terms of national importance and the achievement of a goal, completing this railroad was as momentous as putting Neil Armstrong on the moon just 100 years later. This was big. This was the first media event ever reported live in US history. Much like the world watched Neil Armstrong take one small step on the moon, communities from coast to coast anxiously awaited the telegraph message done from Promontory. Suddenly, travel from New York to San Francisco went from more than 6 months to just 7 days. But it meant more than that. It changed the dinner table fare at American tables. In an instant, communities were not solely reliant on food produced just within 50 miles. It changed how we communicated with the flow of information and the sharing of ideas. The railroad as a network became a great leveler in terms of knowledge and success. Does that sound familiar? How about the idea of being online or offline? Now we're all very familiar with the idea of going online, accessing the great network of the internet, that great leveler of knowledge and access. A child in rural Illinois or rural Oregon has access to the same information online as a child living in New York City. And it might surprise you to learn that the terms online and offline first referred to railroads. Was your community on the line or off? For those on the line, the world opened up, opportunities beckoned, and ideas and goods flowed through your community. It is no accident today that the railroad continues to be an information superhighway with fiber optic cables running beneath the railroad right-of-way. Being online was as important then as it is now. At Promontory, almost 151 years ago, the fledgling territory of Arizona presented a gold and silver spike. They wanted to be online, and they hoped that Union Pacific or Central Pacific could help them get there. But how did it start? You probably know the larger story of the Transcontinental Railroad and the dream that Theodore Judah had to unite California to the rest of the country by rail, and the story of all the track laid, battles fought, and tunnels blasted. That is a conversation for another day. The idea of a transcontinental railroad was a grand one, but not a new one. Let's talk about the story of individuals and chance meetings that changed the course of the future. Abraham Lincoln spent only 3 days in Iowa, but that visit made a permanent mark on the state and its future economy. The purpose of Mr. Lincoln's August 1859 visit was to examine land that had been pledged by Chicago attorney Norman B. Judd as collateral for a loan from Mr. Lincoln. On August 9th, Lincoln left Springfield with Secretary of State Ozias M. Hatch. They arrived in Council Bluffs on Friday, August 12th, 1859. They registered at the Pacific House, described by one historian as a famous hostelry whose chief characteristics were sagging floors and great double porches. Upon arrival, the two Springfield visitors toured the town. They traveled to Cemetery Hill for a panoramic view of the area, and later they dropped back to the Pacific House where they encountered railroad engineer Grenville M. Dodge. Dodge was engaged in real estate at the time, and according to one biographer, he was acting as an agent for the Mississippi and Missouri River Railroad Company, for which he had purchased a large piece of property in Council Bluffs, a portion of which he later resold. Among the purchasers of these new town lots was Norman B. Judd, attorney for the M&M and a legal and political associate of Lincoln. Judd Perkins, the biographer, wrote, believed that this land would become of great value when the M&M Railroad reached Council Bluffs, and as a direct consequence, linked up with the proposed Pacific Railroad. So he bought 17 lots, for which he paid $3,500. And they were very close to that M&M depot grounds that you can see there on the left side of that map. Judd was in financial difficulty, and he wanted to borrow an additional $3,000 from Mr. Lincoln with the land as security. But Perkins says Lincoln wanted to see this land before he made the loan. And more than this, there's certain evidence to show that he made his trip west in 1859 to learn what he could of the railroad situation of western Iowa and eastern Nebraska. For this section seemed about to become important in Pacific Railroad legislation. Now, Lincoln was invited to speak the night after he met with Grenville Dodge. It was Saturday, and a buffet dinner was prepared for the guests in Council Bluffs Park. Unfortunately, some irreverent residents filched the chicken and cake before that dinner could begin. The speech time was set in Concert Hall. It had been announced by local newspapers that, and I quote, "the distinguished succor has yielded to the importunities of our citizen without distinction of parties and will speak on the political issues of the day at the Concert Hall this evening. The celebrity of the speaker will most certainly ensure him a full house. Go and hear old Abe," end quote. Another speaker, a Democratic judge from Indiana, was supposed to present contrasting views to Mr. Lincoln, but ended up agreeing with the Illinois visitor. Many residents came and heard. According to another local paper, and I quote, "the clear and lucid manner in which he set forth the true principles of the Republican Party, the dexterity with which he applied the political scalpel to the Democratic carcass, beggars all description of our hands." End quote. A local Democratic and unsympathetic newspaper reported a much lengthier story after the talk. And I quote, "The people of this city were edified last Saturday evening by a speech from Honorable Abe Lincoln of Illinois. He apologized very handsomely for appearing before an Iowa audience during a campaign in which he was not interested. He then, with many excuses and a lengthy explanation, as if conscious of the nauseous nature of that Black Republican nostrum, announced his intention to speak about the eternal Negro, to use his own language, and entered into a lengthy and ingenious analysis of the question to be agitated until finally settled. He carefully avoided coming directly to the extreme ground occupied by him in his canvass against Douglas results. Amounts to precisely the same thing. He was decidedly unopposed to any fusion or coalition of the Republican Party with the opposition of the South, and clearly proved the correctness of his ground in point of policy. They must retain their sectional organization and sectional character and continue to wage their sectional warfare by slavery agitation. But if the opposition South would accede to their views and adopt their doctrines, he was willing for president in 1860, a Southern man with Northern principles, or in other words, with abolitionist proclivities. His speech was in the character of an exhortation to the Republican Party, but was in reality as good a speech as could have been made for the interest of democracy. He was listened to with much attention, for his Waterloo defeat by Douglas has magnified him into quite a lion here," end quote. After the speech, the host, William Pusey, invited townspeople to his home for an impromptu reception. The following day, Mr. Lincoln went to the Presbyterian church services in Concert Hall before having dinner at the home of Thomas Officer, who formerly resided in Springfield. He apparently left that afternoon. Historian William Barringer wrote, as Lincoln and Hatch traveled homeward, the Iowa press gave him some, but not much, notice to his speech, but it was a gain. Now, some historians have written that the purpose of Lincoln's trip to Iowa was really to look at the possible origination point for a Pacific Railroad, and looking at something that had been in conversation for almost 6 years by that time, because Congress had passed the Congressional Survey Act in 1853. But he came to Council Bluffs to look at that land, at which he finally did give a loan to Judd for the $2,500 at 10% a year, which was the legal maximum and a practical minimum, which economic historian Olivier Frasset says, the lending of money was not a rapid road to wealth, but it accorded far better with Lincoln's cautious temperament than the speculation in which he might have engaged. Now, Lincoln's host, former Springfield resident William Pusey, had recommended Dodge as someone who was knowledgeable about railroads, and Lincoln suggested that they meet him. Dodge was not only knowledgeable about railroads, he was knowledgeable about the lots in question. Now, Grenville Dodge at the time had been in Council Bluffs for about 6 years. His brother, his father, his mother, and his little sister followed him from Massachusetts to Council Bluffs. And he and his brother Nathan were engaged in a real estate enterprise in Council Bluffs. But Dodge was still employed by Henry Farnham with the M&M Railroad and was engaged in surveys across the Missouri River to the west. So Dodge was intimately familiar not only with the land himself, with the economics of the region, but he was also very familiar with the surveyors that had gone out, at least many of them, that had gone out to survey in the 1853 congressional surveys, many of whom returned through or near Council Bluffs and would sit down or visit with Dodge and let him know what they had found. Now, this painting here you can see is a painting by C. Everett Johnson in 1931. This is a mythological retelling of what this meeting may have looked like in Council Bluffs, but it's the only illustration we have to show this visit. Now, as Dodge later remembered it in his autobiography, the future president asked him, Dodge, what's the best route for a Pacific Railroad to the west? And Dodge sketched out that route on a map from this town where we stand out the Platte River Valley. Dodge argued that a railroad could easily follow the Platte's gentle elevation all the way to Colorado. Now, as was his practice, Lincoln peppered Dodge with questions. And I quote from Dodge's autobiography, he shelled my woods completely and got all the information I'd collected. For 2 hours, Dodge and Mr. Lincoln relaxed on the hotel porch and discussed the practicalities of a transcontinental railroad. And years later, Dodge wrote, this interview was of the greatest importance to me. It was a milestone of my life, and I never forgot it. According to a Lincoln friend, that same Pusey, at one point in the visit, Mr. Lincoln predicted, not one, but many railroads will center here. And in fact, those words are immortalized on the Lincoln Monument in Council Bluffs, that is Cemetery Hill, which overlooks the Platte River Valley. Now, Dodge was so transformed by this initial meeting with Abraham Lincoln that he actively campaigned for him the next year in the 1860 election in the Iowa State Convention. And in 1861, he created the 4th Iowa Volunteer Infantry and entered the Union Army as a colonel. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act, or Railway Act, into law on July 1st, 1862. By then, Dodge was a highly regarded Army engineer in charge of railroad construction and reconstruction in the Mississippi region. And railroads and the place of railroads in the Civil War is really the ground for the future building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Many of the lessons that were learned during the war were applied later. Now, by the end of 1863, the Union Army was ready to move into the Southern heartland. And the best place to capture was Atlanta, now the center of what was left of the Southern Railroad grid. However, there were no rivers to supply a Union army fighting south to Atlanta. Retreating Confederates had destroyed railroads across Tennessee. To make progress possible, General Grant ordered General Grenville Dodge to rebuild the Tennessee and Alabama Railroad running south from Nashville. Demonstrating the incredible resilience of both railroads and railroaders, Dodge and his troops, with no real supplies and no proper railroad tools, rebuilt 102 miles of track and 182 bridges using only Army hand tools in just 40 days. That railroad hauled supplies through most of 1864 and cemented Dodge's reputation as a railroad builder. Now, the contrast and compare Southern railroads and Northern railroads is interesting. So if you look at this table on the left and the map on the right, so you can see above Tennessee that the Northern railroads were really connecting population centers, whereas the Southern railroads were radiating from agricultural centers or producers out to waterways or to the coast for export. There was also a size difference. The North controlled 20,000 miles of track, the South just 9. The Northern railroads were under government control from the very beginning. Southern railroads were never under government control. They were privately controlled, and the Confederate Army could only expect hit or miss support during the Civil War. Now, in 1863, then Brigadier General Dodge was ordered to Washington out of Mississippi to meet with the president. And Dodge, at this point, when he receives this order from Grant, is very afraid that he has been called to Washington because of his recruitment and arming of Black soldiers, which at that time was not being done by most Union units. But upon arrival in DC, and this is from his autobiography again, I quote, he reported to the adjutant general, and he informed me that the president wished to see me and made an appointment with President Lincoln for me. I went in and met the president, who greeted me cordially, and I learned from him that I had been called there for the purpose of aiding him in determining the location on the Missouri River where the Union Pacific Railroad should have its initial point. When I heard this, it was a great relief to me. I sat there with him and we discussed that question very fully. And I saw he was thoroughly posted on the sentiment of the country locally, as every town from Sioux City to Kansas City was contending for that location. The people interested at the time remember what a discussion there was in regard to where the initial point of Union Pacific should be located. From an engineering point of view, I pointed out clearly to the president where the line should start and what our surveys had determined. He listened and discussed this question with me for a long time. I saw from his talk and his indication that his views coincided with mine, and I have no doubt he made his decision at that time as recommended by me, and soon after made this order. So this is the order that the Lincoln Library does not have. This is the first order. So this was signed by Lincoln in November of 1863. And it says, I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, do hereby fix so much of the western boundary of the state of Iowa as lies between the north and south boundaries of the United Township, within which the city of Omaha is situated, as the point from which the line of railroad and telegraph in that section mentioned shall be constructed. Now, this particular order was handed to Union Pacific Vice President at the time, Thomas Durant, but it was never widely shared or promoted, as Durant continued his campaign of manipulating communities from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sioux City, Iowa for favorable deals for the railroad to build there. And on March 7th, 1864, President Lincoln was forced to issue the second order. Sorry about that. Which was essentially the same. I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, do upon the application of said company designate and establish such first name point on the western boundary of the state of Iowa, east of and opposite the east line of section 10 in township 15, south of range 13, east of the 6th principal meridian in the territory of Nebraska. So the location defined by President Lincoln was, according to Perkins again, in a township in which Council Bluffs was situated and near a tract of land to which he held the quitclaim deed from Norman Judd. In their conversation, General Dodge pressed the case for moving forward on the railroad's construction. The law of 1862 had been passed, but the promoters of the road had been unable to raise a single dollar to build it. They could not induce the capitalists to take hold of it, notwithstanding the fact that the United States had loaned its credit, it having the first lien on the property, while the company's bonds were only second mortgage bonds. There was no one in the United States then who had enough confidence in the future of Union Pacific Railroad to buy a second mortgage bond at any price. I discussed that question with him. I thought that the government of the United States should build this road. It was too big a job for private enterprise alone. He said the government of the United States had all it could care for then, but that he and the government were willing to do anything they could do to aid any company who would take this matter up in earnest and raise the money and go forward with the work. He intimated that he was perfectly willing to have the law changed so that the government should take second mortgage and the promoters of the road should take the first. From my visit with President Lincoln, I went to New York to see my friends who had organized the Union Pacific Road, John Dix, Henry Farnham, Thomas Durant, Francis Train, and others. And I told them in a board meeting what President Lincoln had said, and they were greatly encouraged and made up their minds to take the matter up, and they went before Congress. And finally, in 1864, the law was passed, which placed the mortgage bonds of the company ahead of the mortgage bonds of the government. And with the governments and other mortgage bonds, they were enabled to start the road. And by 1865, they had built the road as far west as Fremont. Now, despite the Civil War, groundbreaking for Union Pacific began in Omaha in December of 1863. Dodge in 1865 was seriously wounded in battle and out of active military service. But by 1866, he had become chief engineer for Union Pacific. Also in 1866, Union Pacific acquired President Lincoln's funeral car, or personal business car, as it was intended to be, for use during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Union Pacific Vice President Thomas Durant purchased the car for $8,000 and had it sent to Omaha, Nebraska. There, the car went into service as a business car and was seen in the October 1866 excursion to the 100th meridian. You can see that car here. After the railroad was completed in 1869, the car was moved around the system and transferred to the Colorado Central Railroad in the 1870s. There it was used in a variety of ways before ending up as a bunkhouse car in the yard at Pocatello, Idaho in the late 1880s. The car was then spotted by a Union Pacific executive who recognized its importance and sent back to Omaha, where it was stored and rehabilitated in the Omaha Shops facility. Now, sometime before the car was relocated to Colorado and then Idaho, the original furnishings were all removed and stored. Some of the furniture had even shown up in the Union Pacific headquarters building in various offices. The car was then briefly displayed in the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago and in the 1898 Trans-Mississippi Exposition in Omaha, Nebraska. After that, the car was sold for $2,000 without its interior contents, and eventually it ended up outside St. Paul, Minnesota, where it burned in a grass fire in 1911. It was the later discovery of a silver tea service removed from the Lincoln car originally that sparked the creation of the Union Pacific Museum in 1921, creating one of the oldest corporate museums and collections in the United States. That museum continues today at historic Mile Zero, established as the eastern terminus for the first transcontinental railroad by President Lincoln in 1863 and 4. This museum operates today in partnership with the City of Council Bluffs, Union Pacific, and the Union Pacific Museum Association, dedicated to sharing American history through the lens of the railroad, connecting generations who have been impacted by Union Pacific. Now, unfortunately, Abraham Lincoln did not live to see the incredible impact his vision had on the nation. He was not able to be present when the final spike was driven and the message done was broadcast to the world at Promontory. But we can be sure of his influence and impact in one of the most transformative national projects ever undertaken. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There are tons of questions coming in, but I do want to start with just a little bit more information, and you hit on it right there. Just tell us a little bit more about the Union Pacific Railroad Museum, and you're the expert of that, and many of us may have not been there, including myself, so might want to know some more about it.
Sure. I'm just going to stop the share real quick. So,
Perfect.
All right, perfect. So the Union Pacific Museum, like I said, founded in 1921 after the discovery of that first Lincoln silver. Initially, it occupied just a room near the president of Union Pacific's office at their headquarters building in Omaha. Then around 1939, it transitioned to a full museum occupying part of the downstairs first floor of the Union Pacific headquarters building. And there it remained until Union Pacific created a new headquarters across the street. When that happened, the museum was at a bit of a crossroads. The collection went into storage. There were other partnerships considered, but at the same time in Council Bluffs, that beautiful building that I showed you in the first slide was Council Bluffs' first public library, and that building was in danger. The other library had moved out. They had constructed a beautiful new library nearby, and so this historic building was in peril. A concerned Council Bluffs, a group of citizens united to save that building. It coincided with Union Pacific looking for a home for its collection. And the city of Council Bluffs owns the building today. So those three parties came together and created what is now known as the Union Pacific Railroad Museum, which is a partnership between Union Pacific, the nonprofit, and the city of Council Bluffs. And it's been there since 2003. 2 floors of beautiful exhibits. When we're open and hosting visitors, it's a wonderful place to come. It might surprise you. We're one of the few railroad museums in the country that are historic focused and not equipment focused. So really looking at the impact of railroad history on the country.
One of the questions that's come in is what type of artifacts, maybe from the Civil War era, does your museum have?
Oh, interesting. So most of the objects in the Union Pacific collection have to do with the construction of the railroad. So from that time period. We have a paper archive, we have a photographic archive, and we have a 3D object collection. Trying to think of specific objects from that time period, certainly arms, so weapons, Winchester rifles, for example, Henry rifle, but also telegraph equipment. So, we have General Dodge's telegraph equipment when he was in charge, stationed at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and he was in charge of the safety of the Western trails in 64, 65. And we have, like I said, that order signed by Abraham Lincoln, and many other things. So most of the objects that I shared with you, photographs and maps, those all come from our collection.
Well, when it's open, we're going to have to get up there and see it.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions is also, why do you think Abraham Lincoln supported the Pacific Railway Act of 1862? What's the importance of that?
So we know, right, from Lincoln's history that when he was an attorney in Illinois, he was a big proponent of railroads. He represented what became the Rock Island Railroad in the Effie Afton case, where a steamboat ran into a railroad bridge, which was really a transformative case. You had two different forms of transportation colliding literally, and the railroad came out on top in that case. I think that Lincoln really saw the need for what comes later, right? And I think he was really far thinking. So what happens after this, right? Does this conflict just continue to boil west and we never see the end of it? Are we going to lose our tie to California and all of the financial benefit thereof, with the discovery of gold and silver in Nevada? I think he was really looking to the future. I think that's why he supported it and why he thought that it was something to turn the country's interest from warfare to uniting the country.
Absolutely. Well, I think we could say that about Mr. Lincoln's foresight on many topics, and definitely the railroad and the Western expansion. So that's a great point. Are there other politicians besides Mr. Lincoln that played important role in the Union Pacific development?
Yes. I don't know all of them, obviously.
Sure.
But Samuel Curtis from Iowa, introduced the initial legislation in Congress. He was definitely very important. And it is no surprise that most of these people knew each other. Oakes Ames, despite his later, censorship from Congress, the Ames brothers, without their financial support and their leadership, the railroad would not have gotten built. So it was an interesting mix of public servants or politicians, businessmen, and then just people who got stuff done, which is an interesting mix.
Yeah, awesome. Can you tell us more about the workers who might have built the railroad? Who were they? How were they treated? That type of thing.
Okay, well, the 19th century, I don't have to tell you, was not a great time to be a laborer for anybody, right? So, and building a railroad is not easy, even where you have access to infrastructure and supplies and anything you might need. So the people who came to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, clearly during the Civil War, Union Pacific had a very hard time recruiting enough able-bodied men to come and build the railroad. So they started recruiting men who were a little disenfranchised with the government and with the country. And they were looking at immigrants and recent immigrants, specifically Irish immigrants on the Eastern Seaboard who had come or fled to the United States to escape famine in Ireland. And it wasn't sort of working out to be what they had hoped it might be on the East Coast. And the railroad presented an opportunity that, yes, you were going to have to work hard, but there could be a future for you and your family later. So definitely Irish immigrants. The railroad even went to Ireland and started recruiting directly from Ireland. But after 1865, when the war was over, a lot of veterans came to work for Union Pacific. And, that's one thing we trace today is the military structure of the railroad. So the railroad and most railroads today actually operate on a very hierarchical military structure for operations because it is so effective. Now, Central Pacific had different pressures on them with regards to labor. So the Civil War wasn't really affecting them to the degree that it did Union Pacific in Omaha. They were based out of Sacramento, California. But their hiring was complicated by the fact they would source enough labor in San Francisco and in other ports, take them up into the mountains, and then they would disappear overnight to go hunt for gold, right? So you just got them closer to the gold mines. So they were frustrated with the state of affairs. And Charles Crocker, then president of Central Pacific, said, you know what, I think we need to look at immigrant labor to help us here. And of course, Chinese labor was a big force in California at the time after the gold rush. So after 1849, a lot of extra Chinese labor was in place in California. And Central Pacific started hiring Chinese workers through Chinese labor agents, and it was a huge success. Eventually, Central Pacific hired almost 10,000 Chinese to help build the railroad. And without their unique knowledge of gunpowder and explosives, Central Pacific wouldn't have made it through the Sierra Nevada. So that's it in a nutshell.
That's great. That's great. One of the questions has come in about the furniture, and you kind of mentioned that a little bit towards the end of your presentation. Shannon says there are varying accounts about which or how many pieces of furniture in the collection were aboard Mr. Lincoln's funeral car. Could you help to clarify that? Was that just the tea set that we know of, or?
So at the museum, we have on display 2 sofas, a bookcase, a desk, and a rather large armchair, reclining armchair on wheels. In addition to the tea set, 3 mirrors, some paintings as well from friezes inside the car, and an ink and pen, a quill and pen set, and like a desk set on the desk. Just in preparation for this talk, I was looking through our Lincoln car records, and there's confusion, I'm gonna say. Like, there's doubt. We say they are from the Lincoln car. I feel pretty confident we have them on display. We say that. The Missouri Historical Society also has sofas from the Lincoln car. So I'm not sure how many sofas were in this car exactly. It's interesting, the sofas we have on display, one is a trundle and one is a futon that folds down. So, I mean, one could imagine in 1864 when the car was constructed that convertible furniture would have been, of benefit. But I'm afraid I can't shed more light on it. Yeah.
Well, that's helpful. That is helpful. One question's come in is, sorry, these are just random all over.
No, you're fine.
So we're all excited about it. Was Atlanta a regional railroad hub by the time of the Civil War?
So it's interesting. If there were a regional hub in the South, Atlanta was it. But Southern railroads really suffered from the fact that there wasn't any agreement on a lot of things. So there was an agreement on what was a hub. There was an agreement on what was the gauge, which is the space between the rails. There wasn't even agreement on what size those rails should be. So if you think about how railroads were operating in the North, apologies about the dog barking. When you think about what caused the North, had agreements about railroad gauge. They had a standard gauge, which in fact the transcontinental was built in that gauge. They had agreements as to what size of rail they were all going to use, and then they interlinked at railroad hubs. In the South, that was not the case. So if you were taking a trip, let's say from Savannah to Atlanta, you might have to get off your train, walk 50 feet, get on another company's train that had a different width of cars, different width of trucks on the cars, to go on a different width of track, because there was no agreement. So it wasn't really a network, and so there wasn't really a hub. I think Atlanta as a center of industry probably had more lines terminating there just by the fact of its size, but it was difficult at best to call it a hub. So
That's a very interesting management and efficiency lesson, that's for sure. So that's interesting. One of the questions Mary Crane has asked is, did Mr. Lincoln own lots in Council Bluffs?
Yes, he did. Well, he did as far as he held the quitclaim deed from the Judd family, but that property was returned to the Judd family by Mary Lincoln and their son Robert in, I think it was 1875, when the Judd family paid off that loan. So I have seen a lot of discussion by historians that, Lincoln originated the Mile Zero, the eastern terminus, in Council Bluffs because he owned land there and he was looking to get rich quick, which you could certainly do in speculating on the railroad. But clearly that was never his intention, that his family held this quitclaim deed because it was a loan to the Judds, and it was returned to them upon his death. So, you know, if it were his intention, I think, to speculate or make money on that, you know, I don't think that would have happened. But he did own the 17 lots for a time in Council Bluffs, and the recorder here in town actually has his signature in the book.
Very good, very good. Dan asked, the chart indicates that the southern rails were imported. What countries supplied the rails? Or do we know?
So actually, they were importing them from the north. So the north is where the foundries were, the iron foundries and all of the factory towns and everything. So they were importing them from the north. The north was able to make their own. So when war broke out, obviously that supply line was interrupted, making it difficult for them to rebuild and repair. But it is interesting that steel was developed during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, so like 1868, and that was developed in France first. So it's interesting that that technology had to come from Europe.
That's awesome. One of the questions Jim asked, kind of going back to your differences in gauges and such, did Union Pacific standardize gauges of tracks for the railroad then and then into the future?
Yes.
Okay. Very
yes.
good.
Yes. So there was a time, you know, during Lincoln's term, so when he was still alive, that he established the gauge for the Transcontinental Railroad at 5 feet. That is not the standard gauge right now, right? So 3 foot 8 inches is the gauge. So then it was reestablished as being that more standardized gauge, which was a standard for the North, that 3 foot 8 inches. And still is today.
Okay. So some of the questions, I know you said this could even be another presentation, and we'd certainly be open to that, a little bit more conversation about the Transcontinental Railroad. Does it still exist in its original form to an extent?
No, but yes, as well. So the one of the really coolest thing about railroads is that equipment, space, is conserved and reused, and we kind of saw that with the Lincoln car, right? It was purchased as a very swanky business car, and then eventually ended up as a bunk car like 40 years later, but it was still serving a purpose on the road. So the original railroad, Transcontinental Railroad, roughly follows I-80 or Highway 30 through Nebraska, and it's still Union Pacific's main line through Nebraska. But the infrastructure along that route obviously is totally different today, right? So, you know, at first glance, maybe it's easy to think that rail in 1860 looks the same as it did today, but a lot has changed. And there's a lot of technology involved in the tracks, and then also the rail is much larger. Ties are bigger, just because trains are heavier, right? So they changed, but the route's still there, absolutely.
So it started and ended where exactly?
So mile 0 was in Council Bluffs for Union Pacific. Mile 0 was in Sacramento, California for the Central Pacific. And then they built towards the center, which became Promontory Summit, Utah. So just outside of Ogden, Utah, just a little bit to the west and northwest from Ogden. And the railroad, while it began in Council Bluffs for Union Pacific, started construction in Omaha because of the Missouri River, and then came back and put the bridge in after the railroad was completed.
And so it was both passenger cars as well as hauling supplies and such.
Yes.
How long possibly would it have taken to get out west, wherever you might? I mean, if you were going Iowa to California, I can only imagine, but how long would it take? Hypothetically, obviously, we're going back to the 1800s. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to refer you guys to a great book by Robert Louis Stevenson called Across the Plains. And he just journals a journey from New York to San Francisco and on the Transcontinental Railroad. So once he gets to Council Bluffs, it is fascinating. And I think it really brings to life what that experience might have looked like. So before the railroad was completed, you know, it would probably take you about 6 months, maybe up to 8 months to get to California. And you had a couple of choices. You could go overland, which was dangerous and expensive, or you could go by ship around Cape Horn. That was also dangerous and expensive. Or, you could go through the Panama Canal, also dangerous and expensive, by ship. So after the railroad was completed, that trip, that 6 to 8 month trip, went to about 7 to 10 days, depending if you started in New York and went all the way to San Francisco. So it incredibly compressed time and space, literally, for Americans upon its completion.
That's interesting. I know we have many avid readers out in the audience because we're often interviewing authors. So you mentioned there a book that you recommended. Are there any other books that we definitely have to check out?
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many new books about the Transcontinental Railroad and about the idea of railroads during this time period. So one really great book is called Empire's Tracks by Manu Karuka. Really interesting examination of the use of railroads in settlement and colonialism around the world, of which he, examines the Transcontinental Railroad as part of that. I think probably Empire Express by David Hayward Bain is my favorite book about the Transcontinental Railroad. And it's a very thick book, but very readable. And he really evokes the best picture from a social history point of view of what this endeavor was like to be there, what it was like to work on it, what it looked like, what people were thinking. And then, of course, the definitive historian for Union Pacific is Maury Klein. And Maury Klein, I think he has a 3-volume set of books called Union Pacific. And if you're interested in the corporate history and what were they thinking and, all of that, Maury is your guy because he really goes into depth about, from a corporate history perspective, on what this meant.
That sounds good. Those are adding to everyone's reading list for sure. So I noticed when I was checking out your website that you guys are also doing a lot of virtual adult programming. Tell us a little bit more about what you have upcoming, and are they open to the public for everyone to join?
Yes, so all of our programming is open to the public, and you're welcome to join us. We really have an eclectic amount of programming. When you think about railroad history as a lens for generations of people experiencing American history, we have a broad spectrum of things open to us. So coming up, we actually have a spooky railroad trivia night coming up on Saturday, which is a lot of fun, of course, virtual. We also have on November 6th, we're hosting historian Kent Blansett, who is talking about the Indian occupation of Alcatraz Island, the urban relocation of Native Americans in the mid 20th century is a really fascinating point of history and intersects with Union Pacific because railroads were often used to transport these people to these urban centers. And so looking at this Richard Oakes story and the takeover of Alcatraz Island is, really interesting facet of that generational experience of the railroad. On November 10th, we're partnering with several local organizations, including Creighton University, our Union Pacific's Council of Native American Heritage, and our women's group called LEAD. And we're looking at human trafficking and how it intersects with Native American women. And that's on November 10th. So those are just a few things coming up. In January, we're going to be talking with historian Tony Reevy about photographer Lucius Beebe, which is going to be very exciting. So a well-known San Francisco photographer, rail photographer.
Very interesting. So for us lifelong learners, there's definitely plenty of activity for us to continue to learn about Union Pacific, the railroad, and Lincoln of the era. So again, Patricia, we really thank you so much. That just about wraps it up. We have so many questions. If people want to continue to get in contact with you, how would they go about doing that?
So please send me an email, P for Patricia, LABOUNT @UP.com.
Perfect. I'll also put that in the email that goes out to everybody as well. So
Okay.
again, that wraps it up for us. I know I speak for the entire 200 plus audience tonight. It was very educational. I learned a lot. I know our members appreciate the insight tonight as well. Again, without Union Pacific support over the past several years, especially during COVID closure, much of this programming would not have been possible. So a huge thank you to Patricia and Union Pacific for helping us to preserve Mr. Lincoln's legacy. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, and we'll send you out a link tomorrow in the email along with Patricia's contact information so that you can learn more and continue your education in that. You can also always check it out on our YouTube page. We encourage you to share this with others, especially the youth in your life. When we share history with the younger generation, we just encourage future historians. So you might be asking what's coming up in November, and I'm glad you asked because we have a lot of things also coming up in November. November 10th, we have Thomas Brown, a professor of history at the University of South Carolina. He's going to be discussing Civil War monuments, so that's a hot topic right now. And then on November 15th, we have back with us Patricia Davis. She will be portraying Sojourner Truth. So again, one not to be missed. And just one other thing is now's a great time to start thinking about gift giving. So giving a membership to a friend or family member that might enjoy this type of programming is perfect. So please consider giving a gift membership to a friend or family member at this season. So, and as we close out the webinar tonight, a short survey will pop up. This just helps us to improve our offerings for you. And again, Union Pacific and Patricia, and a special shout out to Scott Moore as well. He's our board member. All of you for making this happen and from supporting the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. We just can't thank you enough. So thank you again, and we appreciate you joining us for tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good night, everyone. We'll see you in November. Thanks.